back, everybody, to another week of web design. So this week we're going to be doing some HTML, some CSS, and what we're going to be doing is making this prototype site that we've been working on look a little more like the websites that you're used to seeing. A lot of the sites that you'll see on the internet have huge amounts of complexity, and to get to sites that are like the ones that you traditionally see, we have to go a long way, and probably to really get into the second level of our web design courses. But today we're going to reformat the banner at the top of your page. We're going to create a footer at the bottom of the page, resize those columns so that we get 3 columns across, and then the fourth element is going to be sized below those to create more of a traditional web page type of format. Of course, there's lots of different ways that you can format web pages, but we're going to go for one just based on the content that we've been using so far. And then a big thing we're going to do today is create a navigation bar, and we're going to do a horizontal navigation bar that stretches across just below your banner. And we're also going to make that nav bar functional so that you could steer away to a second page in your site. And we'll talk about how it is that you create multiple HTML documents and have them linked to one another in the same site. Also today, we're going to talk a bit about service providers and hosts and domain names, and about how it is that you would create a site and put that site up on the internet using a service provider. So join me next on the computer and let's go ahead and make these prototype sites look a little more like the sites you're used to seeing when you're browsing the World Wide Web. All right, team, so let's see if we can't make this look a little more like a website. We've gotten this far with our sites, and, you know, as you can see, they look pretty good, but it doesn't really look like a website or function like a website, and there's a number of things we're going to change to try and get a little bit closer to that. So let's just start off by improving this banner up here a little bit. So over here is our file structure right now. That's the name of the last version of this that I was working in. And we've got our CSS and our HTML here. So let's open this up. I'm using text editor because I'm on an Apple. So here is my HTML. And let's open up the CSS also, so I have that to work with. And place these side by side. I'm going to make that a little bigger so I can see it. And I'm going to ultimately need a little more space on my CSS also. And we'll be sort of, I want to place this. Let's do it like that so that I can get at everything relatively easily. Or maybe, let's see, do it like this. So there's my CSS, there's my HTML, and there's my site back there. So that way, when I'm working, I can sort of click on the site and see it, and then I can easily get back to the documents I'm working on. I'm being attacked by a fly right now, so just, okay. All right, and it's going to continue to attack me, I'm sure, the entire time I'm working on the video, so just hang in there, folks. All right, so let's start with this banner. The banner is looks okay right now, but let's make it a little bit better. The first thing I'm going to do is change it away from an H1. So these H1s are different headings, but my banner is not really intended to be just a heading like, you know, our H1, H2, and H3 levels. So I don't want it to be characterized as such inside of my HTML. And so what I'm going to do is just change it to a div like we used last time. And div, we talked about, is just a way to categorize things or break things up into different groups. So like we created our div class of columns And this is going to be a class, I'm just going to call it banner. So I had already made H1 into a class called banner, but I don't want it to be a H1 header. I just want it to be its own thing. So I'm going to change it to div. So I'm just going into my HTML and I'm changing H1 to div, div. All right. And I'll save that once I've done it, and that'll immediately make a change. So when I go over here, if I refresh, where's my little refresh? Maybe I'll do it this way. I can just open up my index. So we'll do open with and index, open with Safari. Bam, there we go. All right, so now I open it with Safari. Now it looks like this because I changed it away from that. Okay, and it's giving me my little refresh button, so that's better. So now I will start doing some CSS on it. So I'm going to go over to my CSS, and first thing I'm going to do is clean this CSS just a little bit. For my classes and stuff that are going to be larger groups, I'm going to have down here. So I'm going to just move these two single line CSS elements. I'm just going to cut them out and then paste them up at the top. And it'll just make it a little easier for me to kind of see what I'm working on. And so that dot banner formatting, I've got that already in here. So I've started to adjust that class in the CSS from last week, and I'd set it to no margin, and I'd given it a 15 pixel border and a width of 100%, and I've colored it with light blue text and a green background. So now what I want to do with the banner is I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this margin, because I want it to stretch all the way across the screen. So I'm going to get rid of the margin. Let's leave that. Because it's a 0 margin, so that's good. We'll leave that that way. I do want to get rid of the border, though. We're not going to need this green border anymore. Sort of what I was doing with the border last week is I was sort of thickening up the banner a little bit. But we're going to do that a different way. So I'm going to get rid of the border. And so the color, we want to stay the same as it is. And let's change the alignment of the text. So I'm going to go text align. And let's center the text. So text align center, don't forget your semicolon at the end. And I'm going to change the font size too, because see how small the font size got when I took off the H1, so I need to make it bigger. So we're going to go font size, and we will make it 100 pixels. And put the semicolon there, and then I'll save this CSS. Come back over here and refresh. Okay, that looks better. All right, so now we have a banner that's more like this. So that's good stuff. And let's move on now and adjust these columns. So I want to improve the columns a little bit. And the first thing I want to do is add a border to these columns. So we're going to do this stuff in the CSS. So I'm coming over here to my column CSS rules, and let's take a look. Right now we've got it floating to the left. We've got a width of 22%. I'm going to change that to 27%. Because I'm going to attempt to create a layout of the site. Instead of 4 across like this, I'm going to try and make this food ranking go underneath of the 3 columns and be its own thing as a footer. And so we'll get to that in a little bit. But ultimately what I'm saying here is I'm I want to change this width to 27%. Remember, I can't make it a full 33% because of margins and borders and stuff. So I'm changing that to 27%. I think I am comfortable with this padding at all 25s. And I want to add a border now. So I'm going to just go ahead and go here. And I'll hit... I guess tab's not working for me, so I'm just going to space over a little bit just to make it a little easier for you guys to read it. And I'll just go border. And let's set the border at 5 pixels. And we want it to be solid and green. Yeah, that's going to look good. So we'll work on those, and let's also set a height. So remember I said that I want these all to sort of be even across, and they'll look funny if I don't set them all at the same height. So and we'll set the height. Let's try 650 pixels. I want it to sort of fit everything in. Depending on the size of your images and your paragraphs, etc., you'll have to experiment with heights when you do something like this. But I'm going to try 650. So 650 height, floating left, width of 27%. We're going to have the padding on there. And let's add a margin too. See, everything all mushed together like that doesn't look good. So let's add a margin. And let's go with, we'll go the same thing as the padding, I guess. So we'll go 25 pixels 4 times. Remember, top, bottom, left, and right. Okay, semicolon at the end. Let's save this and refresh and see what we get. Okay, so there we go. Now, we're going to work on this a little bit. They're even across the top, not so even with the border. Let's keep going and see how this works out once I start adding some of the other elements to it. Okay? So far, though, that looks all right. Okay, so from there, let's take a look at the rankings, and we're going to try and create that as a footer. So in order to do that, we're going to have to add some div classes to the HTML. So let's go down here and take a look at what we've got. Right now, we've got the div class as a column. It's one of the 4 columns, and we're going to change that now. So we're going to actually call this div class footer and rankings. So the first one is just going to be the title, and we will call this footer. And I want to close this div class out, actually. So I'll just do the closing div tag there. And that's just going to apply to the actual title ranking of the foods, okay? And then we're going to add another div class, and we'll call that ranking. Oops. Yeah. And we will close that div class out just at the very end here.
Violet Kirkcallis, please report to the front office. Violet Kirkcallis.
Okay, so now I've closed that div out, and I'll save it. But it's not going to do much yet because I haven't laid out what the characteristics of those two div classes are. So let's do that now. Surely that's going to be fine. So we'll go back over to our CSS and let's first lay out the footer characteristics. So I'll add that in here. You know what, and I'll move this up to the top too. Okay, so dot footer. So remember, I've created these classes. I've created divisions in the HTML. Okay, so I've divided them out. So I had the columns, and I decided to not make this a part of the class of columns that has the properties of columns. I've decided to make it its own thing. And so there's going to be the footer and then the rankings underneath of it. And the footer is going to be kind of like a banner at the bottom. And so what we're going to do with this footer is I'm going to go ahead and clear the left. So I'm going to make my opening and closing tags. And by clearing the left, so this is a new CSS property that we're adding. And what that's going to do is say, I don't want anything to the left of this. And that'll keep it from showing up alongside over here. It'll say that, you know, it can't be over here. If I make this wide enough, you know, potentially this could pop up over here. And I don't want it to do that when I float it. So I'm just going to clear it on the left. And it's just a good sort of practice to get into, and it'll make sure that it ends up being on its own row for the purposes of what we're doing here. So I went clear left, and you can clear right, you can clear both, but for the purposes of what I'm doing, I'm just clearing left. So we're going to do that to the footer section, and then afterwards, let's create a zero margin. Let's go ahead and set its width to go across the entire screen, okay? So width is going to be set to 100%. Let's carry on here and go set our colors. So what I think we'll do here is we'll invert our colors a little bit. So I'm going to go color green and make the text green. And then I will go background color light blue. Which fits into the color scheme that we've been using, but it's just inverting them for this banner. And so you got to watch. See, the spell check tried to separate those two words, but I don't want it to do that. Okay, so then we go background color, and let's once again, just like we did at the banner at the top, we're going to do text align, and we're going to center everything. And also, like we did at the top, we're going to go font size. And I'll use 100 pixels again. Okay. Let's save this. Refresh. That does not look good to me. So width is 100%. Font size. Let's go 70 pixels. Even smaller. $50. Save it and let's take a look now. Yeah, that's better. Okay. So then from there, so that's our footer. Now we want to adjust the rankings class. So once again, we'll just go dot rankings. And put our opening and closing brackets in. And set some properties for the rankings. Let's make the color of the text green. Let's make the font size 30 pixels. And let's text align center. Okay. Save that. Refresh. All right, what did we do wrong here? So dot rankings, let's see. The div class. Okay, so look, I called the class ranking over here and I typed in rankings plural over here and it's not going to know the difference. So I'll have to go save again, refresh. There we go. All right, so now we have a little more of a traditional looking website kind of a thing happening here. Okay, so now one of the things that we're really missing a lot is having a navigation bar. And there's nothing to navigate to at this point because there's only one page on this website. You know, but you're used to having a website that's got a navigation bar at the top or on the side that links to other pages inside of the website. Now, with some of the new sort of standards for web pages, especially with the move towards mobile, a lot of folks aren't doing that with sites. They're choosing to make everything scroll all on one page. But for our purposes here, I'm going to show you how to make a navigation bar that would go to additional pages. So the first thing I need to do is actually create a page 2. And we don't need to do anything fancy here. I'm just going to duplicate that index and rename it. And I'll just call it page 2. Okay, and I'm going to open up page 2 with my text editor. And let's just rename it at the top so that it's easy for us to tell that it's a different page. We'll just call it page 2. I like all, let's do all caps. Okay, so we're going to call that page 2, and I'll save it. Now, if I open page 2 with Safari, that's what you get, okay? Page 2 looks like that, and it's easy for us to tell that it's the second page. So let's go ahead and add a navigation bar to our index. So I've duplicated and renamed and given us a page that we can go to. And so let's create a navigation bar both in CSS and in HTML. So first let's start in our HTML. And we'll want the navigation bar to show up just underneath of our banner. So we will just create a new div and we're going to call it navbar. So we're going to create a new div and give it a class of navbar. So I'll go so div class equals, and I'm just, you could call it what you want, but I'm going to call it navbar. Same syntax as any other div class creation. And I'll go ahead and close that div out, create the closing div class. And then we can just go back and fill in the necessary stuff. Okay. So what do we need in this? I'm going to construct this as a list, and then we'll have each list. Sorry, the fly's still attacking me. So I'm going to create this as an unordered list, and then we're going to do some stuff to it. So let's just start by creating the syntax for an unordered list. So I'll just do opening and closing tags for that. Okay, so there you go. And now we need to put our list items in. And so the number of list items would be the number of pages that you want to navigate to. And so let's just do, we'll do 4 items. So, and I'll do opening and closing. Now, instead of typing that out several times, I'm going to create a little space here, go like this, and copy that is what I just did. So I'll copy it once, copy it twice, it's 3 times. All right, so now I have a list created with the ability to populate the list. All right. And inside of this list, we're actually going to put in HTML links, okay, hyperlinks. That's essentially what your navbar is, right? Is it links to other pages on the internet. Now, the kind of link that we're going to put in is going to be an href to more similar to like when we put images into a page, because it's going to refer back to the same HTML document that you're, not the same HTML document, but the same files, local files that you're working with. It's not going to some web page out on the internet. We'll talk about that more in a second, but we're just going to add this stuff in, and the page that we're going to link to every time is going to be that page 2 document that I created over here. Now, obviously, when you are creating a website that is intended for other people, that's going to have extra content, each page is going to be named something different. But for the example that we're doing here, we're just going to refer to that page 2. So let's just go ahead and add this in, and it's that same A tag that we use. So A, and we'll do href. Same syntax that we've worked on before, href equals, and then you have to tell it where it's linking to, and it's going to be page 2 dot, it's a HTML document, okay? That's the suffix on there. So it's page 2 dot HTML, then we go ahead and put in our quotation marks and our closing bracket here. And then from there, we have to actually put in what the page is going to say. So I'm just going to name these. Well, let's go ahead and do this. Since I'm going to do it's going to be the same every time. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. and I'll place it in for each of these. Okay, so there you go. And now in each of these, I just need to, and let's do our closing A tag for each one also. So I'll just do here like that, right? So we have a hyperlink inside of a list item. If you need to kind of stay with understanding what we're doing here. And with HTML, we have to have opening and closing tags. And we have sort of a dual element here, right? We have, this is the whole list, and then there's each list item which has its own opening and closing LI tag, and it's a hyperlink inside of, it's a hyperlink as each list item. And so I have the opening and closing hyperlink tags. And then in here, I just have to have the text that it actually reads. So I'm just going to go with sort of my theme of my page. And it was bacon, cheese, veggies, right? So I'm just going to go, and I'll do all caps. Bacon, cheese, veggies, and I'll have a page and I'll just call it other. So that'll give me, that would give me 4 items on my navigation bar. Okay. Let's see, what does that look different? Just the length of the words, because these are all even here. So yeah, it's just the length of the words that's making it look a little different. So we'll stick with that. I want one space there. Okay, so here we go. And I'm going to save this HTML. Now, this list is not formatted at all. It is going to lead to that same page 2 page if everything is constructed the way I should have made it. Page 2, because I'm not putting in a link to a folder here like we would if we were navigating to a source image for the images. So look here, images.bacon. It's not in a separate folder. It's in that same root folder as the index file. And so that's our file path within our website files set up that way. So we need to go over now to our CSS and create some rules for this navbar div class that we've created. So I'm going to go right here, and here I'll stretch this down so we can see a little more. And let's go ahead and go dot navbar. Oops, I'm going to turn off this caps lock. Navbar, okay, and make my opening and closing tags. And let's start creating the rules for the nav bar. And here's an interesting thing that you need to understand about what I'm doing here. So remember, I said that there's various elements of the list. So inside of this class, I've got the unordered list, which has properties. I have the list elements, which have properties, and I also have the hyper tags that have, or the hyperlinks that also have properties. So inside of the navbar, we've got what are called combinators, okay, where I have to give specific CSS styling to each element. So let's start with just the unordered list. And the way that you type that in the CSS is by putting the class and then a space and then the particular element inside of that class that you're styling. So for the list items, what I'm going to do is have them appear in line. Because if I were to just display this now, it would show up as a list one below the other. And that would be good for a side navigation bar, but what I want is an inline navigation bar underneath of the banner. So I want that to show up in line. And actually I'm going to want everything to show up in the center. So the list items will be formatted in line, but for the unordered list in its totality, we need to make it centered so that when I populate it, it'll show up here and not over here. Okay. So when I come back over here, I'm going to go, with my unordered list, I'm going to go text align center. Okay, so text align center, and I want no margin and no padding. Okay, so text align, margin, and padding both set to 0. All right, so that is the CSS styling for the unordered list itself that's making the nav bar. Okay, so now we're going to do the next element of it, and it's going to be nav bar, and these are those list items, the individual items on the list. And I just need to do one thing to those. And that is, as I said before, they need to be in line. So I'll go display in line. So that's a display setting. And that's going to make that nav bar display its elements in line, okay? And then we need to style the individual hyperlinks, because they'll behave differently than just list items because they're hyperlinks. You know, the tag that they're inside of, you have to kind of drill down into it. So first, we did the unordered list. So these are the first tags. So we said, this, you know, this is the behavior of the ultimate, of the large chunk inside of unordered list. But then, you know, each thing is housed inside of tags inside of it. So I said for the unordered list, align all of this stuff to the center. Okay, so it's going to do that. And give it no margin and no padding. So that I did for the, you know, the overall. Then I drilled down into it and I said, for these list items, okay, I want them to be displayed in line. So that's how they'll show up. But to actually get to the text, I have to drill all the way down inside of it, because those are contained inside of hyperlink text. So let's do this last item. So nav bar, and it's going to be A, and I'll create my opening and closing brackets. And let's give the behavior of those, and I want to color the text green so that it matches with the theme that we're working on. And let's adjust the font size. Let's go 40 pixels and see how that looks. All right, so I'm going to save this CSS. I think my HTML is all saved. And let's see what we get. Okay, so now I've got my elements. They're hyperlinks. I've sort of created a structure here where I've got my columns. If I go too small, then it'll start populating it down to another row. But at a normal width, I've got 3 across and 1 below. which works for what I'm doing, right? My rankings of the food should be sort of separate. And then I've got this nav bar up here, and if I click to that, it goes to page 2. Now, I didn't style the HTML. I didn't change the HTML on the page 2 to give it a nav bar. But I've got it here. Okay, so I'd have to add that nav bar to page 2 to have the nav bar. So now we're getting towards something that is more like a traditional web page by adding these elements. Okay, this goes on and on and on, but now you're starting to see how all of this stuff is created. Let's talk about how your web page actually gets up on the internet. So what you need is a host and a domain name to make that happen. And what are these things? What's a host? What's a domain name? Let's see if I can sort of explain that a little more to you. There we go. So a web host is sort of like a computer that you rent from someone to host your site. Technically, you could host your own site, but your computer would have to always be on, and it would have to be set up to take all of these queries at a single time if you have a bunch of people coming to your site. So you pay a service provider like GoDaddy is a very popular one. Amazon does web hosting, and it's a place where you store your site. You can sort of think of it as a house that your site goes into. All the stuff we've made so far is like the furniture, right? It's the way that your site looks when you're inside of it. And so that's all the data that you have hosted here. This is sort of the furniture of your house, right? And then it gets more specific. These could be the rooms. These could be sort of the rooms of your house, the different pages that you can go to. And then the images are sort of like furniture in it. And also the HTML and CSS styling is what your site actually looks like. The house itself is contained by the host. So you take all of the furniture and all of the stylings, everything, and you generally rent this building. You could set up your own server, like I said, but in general, you pay a host to take all of the stuff that you've styled and put it up somewhere where it's easily accessible by folks. Now, how do they find your house? Well, they find your house with a domain name. Okay, which is the address of your house. But it gets a little more complicated than that because you need to now understand what an IP address is. An IP address is a unique number assigned to devices on the computer. So the host that you rent from, whatever, they will give you an IP address that's the device that they actually place your site on, okay? And then that IP address needs an easy way to find it because technically if somebody knew your IP address, which is going to consist of 4 numbers, each of which containing 1 to 3 digits with a single dot separating each one, and the 4 numbers can range from 0 to 255, all right? If somebody knows that IP address, they could actually enter that in and find your site, but it's really tough for people to remember those numbers. So instead, what we do is we go to a domain registrar and we purchase a domain name or rent a domain name, which is going to be, like facebook.com, right? That's a domain name. You type in facebook.com and then it goes to something called a DNS server, which will redirect to that IP address. So people they type in Facebook, but then it'll go to the IP address where Facebook's files are actually stored at, which will then via internet protocol render on your computer. What you would do when you create your own website is you create all the stuff that we've created so far in the file structure like we have so far. So you'll have your HTML and you'll have your HTML documents and you'll have your CSS and you'll have your images. all stored properly the way that we've been doing it here. And you would use most like an FTP client, which is a file transfer protocol client. A lot of times those are provided by the host that you choose to use. Mozilla, I think, is the name of the one that I use. That might be incorrect, but there's different ones. But you would use that FTP client to actually upload these, to transfer the files to your host. Then these files will be up on the host, and they can be found through the domain name that you rent or pay for, which is the people will put in, let's say it's mrsmith.com, right? You would type in mrsmith.com. That would go to the DNS server. And the DNS server would say, oh, okay, mrsmith.com, that means this IP address. And then that would send you to the specific device that your host is using to store this site. It would go to the HTML page, and it would then render your page, okay? And inside of that page, if you have a nav bar, you're going to have the HTML, which will then link to the other HTML documents that then have the instructions for your other page. So that's how a site works, okay? So it starts with your HTML document, which then points everything. Let's go. The first thing is you create, the first thing you would do is you would find a host, okay? So your host is provides you a device on which the files that you're going to use to create your website will be stored, okay? So your host would give you an IP address. Then you are going to pay a domain name registrar for a domain name, okay? So that's going to give you a specific name, like I said, mrsmith.com. That domain name links to the IP address. Your users will type in the domain name, which will direct them to the IP address. On the IP address, you're going to have your HTML index file, which is what will open up when they go to the IP address. That will then render the HTML and CSS that you've created. And that's how people see your website. So it goes IP address, domain name, and that's how your user accesses everything. Your HTML and CSS are on your host, which has an IP address, which your users find by entering in a domain name. And that's then how they see the content that you have provided. Okay? So that's important to understand, is that you create your HTML files in CSS, which is like the furniture inside of a house, okay? Your users find the house by going to a domain name which links to an IP address. And then the house itself, or where your actual site is stored, is on a host, okay? So you've created now, by following these instructions, you should have a site which has, we're going for 3 columns. I want a nav bar on this time, and the nav bar should work. Okay, I should be able to click on it and find your site. So I go back to the Finder. I can open up my index. There's my page. If I want to actually go to the other page, I can use the nav bar. I've created a footer down here, so I've got sort of 2 rows, my 3 across here. I've got another banner. I've improved the banner up here, and so we've created a bit of a website. So what I'm going to be looking for you to do is, on the site you've created so far, reformat the banner, add a navigation bar that's functional, and reformat into a row of 3, then a second banner down here, and the content below that this way. So it has sort of a web page look. I want the border around the columns of your main content, and, you know, an adjustment of fonts and color to the second banner. Okay, everybody, so I know that was a lot to take in all at once. So you can rewatch and rewind the video, that sort of thing, to better understand things. But I want you to redo the banner at the top of your page. I want you to create those 3 columns with a border around them. I want you to create a sort of footer banner beneath the 3 columns, and then the list I want to appear below that banner in a centered font that's bigger and in a nice satisfying color that goes with your site. Perhaps most importantly, I want you to create a navigation bar that appears above the top banner of your site, and I want that navigation bar to be functional so that when I get the file, I can click on links and go to a separate page. I don't care about the second page. Just change something about the other page so it's apparent to me when the link works that I've gone to another page, okay? So set that up. So we should have a nice functional website that looks a little more like a site you would see on the internet. You know, and also it's important that you understood what I was talking about, what your server does, what your host does, that when you pay for a host, let's say you use GoDaddy or somebody else to be a host for your site, you need to know what your domain name is, what it does, right? What a DNS server is. But most importantly, I want you to know what your domain name is, because you have to pay for that separately. When you get a site, you have to pay for a domain name. And a big problem is a lot of times the name you want might be taken. Okay, I want you to know what your host does, because those are the 2 big things that you have to pay for, is a domain name and a host for your site and what that does. And you should also understand that what a FTP client is, that FTP client is just a tool that allows you to transfer your files, you know, your HTML documents and CSS, those folders, transfer those over to your host so that then your site will populate on the internet when someone goes to your domain name, which of course leads back to your IP address. So it's important that you understand that stuff, because you know, you can make a site, but if you don't understand how to actually get it out into the world using a host with a domain name on your site, then it's all for nothing, right? So I'll be looking forward to seeing these sites this week. Remember, I want the banner, I want the 3 columns with a border around them that take up the next level of the page. I want the navigation bar between that banner and those 3 columns. I want the footer banner at the bottom of it with your list below that footer banner. I want the nav bar to be functional. Really looking forward to seeing everybody's sites get to the next level and get those to me as soon as you can.